Hey guys, welcome back to Southwest Victory Gardens. My name is Brandon. On this channel, we talk all about backyard gardening in desert climates. So thanks for checking out this video. I really appreciate it. We're gonna talk today a little bit about composting. I wanna share with y'all 5 tips that I think will help y'all out if you are new to composting in desert climates. There's a ton of resources out there for composters on YouTube, on the internet, but a lot of that stuff doesn't really, apply to, desert composters. A lot of compost, videos will say just add, leaves and grass clippings and stuff like that, and you look around and there's no lawns, or there shouldn't be lawns, and the trees we have don't really have big leaves, so we don't have a lot of the resources that folks are talking about when they're talking about building compost piles. And so sometimes for desert gardeners, we have to, it's a little bit more confusing. We have to be a little bit more resourceful. So I want to share with you 5 things that I've learned about composting in desert climates that I hope will help y'all along the way. It took me a while to really figure out composting. I started composting the day that I started my first garden. And so I've been learning to garden and learning to compost ever since. And the two are basically, linked. If you're going to grow a garden, you really want to have a compost pile. In the last video we incorporated weeds and things into our garden to get it started, to add some organic matter into the soil. But it would have been much better if we had composted those weeds first and then added the compost to the soil. So, it's a really great way to improve your soil, and it's going to help you in a lot of ways. It's going to help you keep waste out of the landfill. It's going to help you keep, your yard waste, your food waste, and all of that, from contributing to climate change and all of that. You can have a compost pile of any size, and it's going to really, do a lot of good for you. So let's go ahead and get into the 5 things that I think are the most important when it comes to desert composting. So number 1, I want y'all to start small. When I first started composting, I was so excited. I went out and all the vegetable scraps I could find, and I put them together, and I had this tiny little compost pile. And that's how I learned. I learned by watching a small compost pile, decompose very slowly. And then as I got, more into it, I ended up, going all out and finding, food scraps from restaurants and getting coffee grounds and all of that stuff and making real big compost piles. And that was fun, but it was a lot of work. And so what I'm going to suggest for y'all is just to, start small. I have these super big, 5-foot bins out here that I use for composting because I have a lot of yard waste, and, sometimes I get waste from, work, and I have food waste. But you can, recreate something very similar that's, a lot smaller. And if you were just to say add your, coffee grounds and your food waste, to this every once in a while, once or twice a week, this would take a real long time to fill up, and so something like that would be perfect for folks that are starting. So number 1, I want y'all to just start small, and then you can work your way up into making more and more compost. And if you have the need to go bigger, then you can always go bigger. Number 2, I want you to be mindful of water. So compost needs water, just like your garden needs water. Compost needs water. So we want to make sure that we can keep our compost from drying out, because that's going to slow down the composting process. It's going to, not really allow the material to decompose very rapidly. And that's the whole point of composting, is we're trying to get the material to decompose faster, right? And so when it dries out, it doesn't really decompose. And so we don't want to let that happen. And so a couple ways you can do that are, one is to build a really super big pile, because no matter what, a really big compost pile like this one you have here, it might be dry on the outside, but in the middle, it's going to stay moist a lot of the time, right? So that's one way you can do it. Another way is you can actually go ahead and irrigate your compost pile. There's a really great gardener locally. His name's Sotero, and he has a cool YouTube channel as well called the Sonora Desert Grower. And he was telling me that he actually puts dripper line irrigation around his compost, puts it on a timer, and waters his compost just like you would water your vegetable garden. So that's one thing you can do. But you want to make sure that you help your compost stay moist so you can build it big. You also want to maybe put it in a shaded area. So if you can put it under a tree or somewhere on the side of your house, maybe in between the wall and the house, somewhere where you get a lot of shade, that's going to help it stay moist as well. So be really mindful of that, because it's going to help your composting by not letting your compost dry out. And that sort of leads me into the third tip that I have for desert gardeners or desert composters, and that is to avoid compost bins or tumblers, especially any sort of black barrel type tumbler. Black barrel tumblers are notorious for just heating up really, really hot from the desert heat and drying up all of the material inside, and it just kind of cooks it. And so there's no benefit, you know, there's no decomposition. You just end up with this dried mess of rotted vegetables, you know, that are basically dehydrated and baked inside of the bin. You know, so they don't really allow, you know, insects to, you know, get in to do decomposing. They don't allow airflow. And so for a lot of reasons, those bins don't work very well in desert climates. They might work well in other places. You know, I'm sure they probably do. But here in the desert, and especially if they're in any kind of sunny area, they really don't perform well. So I'm going to recommend that you avoid any of those bin type tumblers. And if you do use one, I recommend getting one that turns on a gear versus turning on a center axle, because when you have a big, you know, compost bin and it's full, trying to turn it on an axle can be difficult. So some of those types that have gear systems are a lot easier to turn. So I would recommend something like that, and as big as possible, and most certainly put it in a shaded area. But avoid them if you can, and just, you know, put a pile in the back corner of your yard. It's a much, you know, lay out a piece of a cardboard and pile it on that, or better yet, just put the cardboard box out in the back of the yard and put everything in the cardboard box. It would be a much better way than using one of those black bins or tumblers. So avoid those tumblers if you can, and just use something a little more, you know, like put together like a wire bin or something like that. All right, so the fourth thing is something I've learned over the years of composting and how compost works in our desert soils. And one of the things I'm going to recommend, the fourth thing I'm going to recommend for you, is to avoid or limit, rather, your use of manures. Especially manures from any sort of like feeding operation. So cattle manure from like Home Depot. The horse manure is particularly bad. And you know, any manure from a source that you're not familiar with, I would just avoid it. If you have, you know, chickens, or you have goats, you know, or you have, you know, other animals that you could use, rabbits, you know, has good compostable manure, you know, go for it and definitely use it. But if you have to go out and source it, and if you have to buy it, just don't even bother. One of the things that manures can do is add a lot of salts into our soils. So when you combine that with some of our hard water issues that we already have, a lot of times we can get heavy salt accumulations in our soils if we're not using rainwater and we're using a lot of manures in the soil. And then when we get salt buildup in the soil, that just leads to all kinds of problems down the way. And so what I've learned is that, you know, you can make really good compost using just plants, you know, weeds, you know, grass clippings, you know, yard waste, you know, all of the stuff we think of when we think of just, you know, landscape waste and materials combined with our food scraps are plenty. You know, those can decompose nicely, and we don't necessarily need manure in our compost. A lot of compost recipes call for, you know, 20% manure or whatever. But I would say for desert soils, you want to really limit the manure, and especially if you have to go out and buy it, just avoid it altogether. And most certainly you want to avoid horse manure and cattle manure if you can. You know, and if you do have to use those manures, or you do end up with that kind of compost, then go ahead and, you know, limit how much you use, and do periodic soil testing to tell you whether or not you have high salt content or too much compost or anything like that in your soils. So All right, so fifth thing for desert composters, this is going to help you a lot, and that is, you got to learn to be creative as a desert composter. Like I said, we don't have leaves, we don't have grass clippings, there's not a lot of, tree trimmers around here dropping off wood chips to people. So you got to sort of learn to be creative. And what I mean by that is, like, maybe you got to go out and, go to some of the local breweries that have spent grain, or you got to go to some of the local coffee shops that have, coffee grounds, or folks that roast coffee have, like the chaff from the roasted beans. So you can be creative in that way. You can also be creative about, using things around your yard that you probably wouldn't use otherwise. Things like weeds, for example. A lot of composting books and articles and videos advise folks to not use weeds in their compost. And obviously, you're going to run into an issue if you have weeds in your compost and then you go to use the compost in your garden, and then you're going to get weeds, right? Well, unfortunately, here in the desert, we don't have a lot of options in that regard. Weeds are one of the only sources of green materials that we have. And so we sort of have to use weeds because really it's all we have. So what you could do is, weeds that don't have a flower don't have seed. So you can always try and pick the weeds before they go to flower, or you can pick the flowers off and maybe put that somewhere else. And then use the rest of the plant, or you can get one of those really big compost piles going where it gets super hot and then it cooks the seeds off, and that can be something too that over time, if you're able to get enough materials together, you can get a really hot pile going, and then you could cook those seeds down, and so you don't have to worry about it. So you gotta, basically you gotta be creative. So whether that's using weeds or going out and developing relationships with restaurants to get food scraps and things like that, if you really want to start generating a lot of compost, or maybe you go out and buy the materials to make compost. You can buy a bale of hay and a bale of straw and mix those together, and and maybe add some yard waste and your food scraps to that, and you could compost that way. So don't feel like you necessarily have to do like exactly like what this compost recipe says, or what the books are advising. You're as a desert gardener, sometimes we got to be a little bit more creative about how we compost, and not necessarily go by the book. There's I compost my old t-shirt, my old hat that's fallen apart. It's like a palm frond hat, so it's made of natural materials. So I compost that. I'm cutting my hair later. I'm going to sweep up my hair and I'm going to put that into the compost pile. All that stuff's made of natural materials, and so I could go ahead and compost it. So be creative, use what you have, and be resourceful. And if at all possible, avoid having to go out and like buy materials or drive around to source your materials. Try and get everything you can as close to home as possible. And then if you need, then go out a little bit further. But fortunately here in Tucson, there's a lot of resources for composters, and so if you just look around, you're going to be able to find a lot of stuff. All right, so I hope those 5 tips help you out. If you want to learn how to compost or how to build a compost pile or that kind of stuff, I'm going to put some links down below to some desert composting resources from the Tucson Organic Gardeners, the Community Food Bank, as well as some resources that I've put together. And then check out YouTube, and there's lots of videos on composting. And we'll do more videos eventually, but I just wanted to do this quick video so that as you maybe starting your victory garden endeavor, you know where to start, and you can avoid some of the challenges that I faced when I first started composting. So thanks for checking out this video. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one. So take care.